Hello there and welcome. This session explains how to properly print your Excel spreadsheet utilizing Print Preview and a variety of print and page layout settings. To get started printing the Excel spreadsheet, we'll go into the File tab and click on Print. This will give us a preview of how the spreadsheet will appear on the printed page and give us access to the basic print settings. So we can see initially that it's not going to print as we might want it to. It's cutting off that chart right there in the middle. So one of the very common settings that we have to tweak here is to just turn the page. That's the orientation. So currently the orientation is portrait. Let's switch that over to landscape. So I'm clicking on the portrait orientation option, selecting landscape, and it should fit a lot better. And in order to print this, I just need to go ahead and click on the print button. You're also going to need to consider what needs to be printed. By default, Excel assumes you want to print everything that's on the page, and that may or may not be the case at all times. So the way you control that is using a setting called the print area. And the way that you state what needs to be printed is by selecting the information on the sheet itself. So perhaps it's this area that needs to be printed. You just click and drag to select it. And on the page layout tab of the ribbon, there is an option here called print area. So you'll give that a click and you'll select set print area. Now when I go into print preview, file print, or you can use your Control P shortcut, that is what's going to print. Swing back outside. So using the arrow in the top left to get out of there. And if you need to change that at any point to include more or less, again, the steps are just selecting what needs to be printed. On the page layout tab of the ribbon, using the print area button, you can click on set print area. And then what happens is as you go into file print, that is what tells Excel exactly what needs to be printed on your page. You'll also notice that Excel will assume you would like the information to print on the page beginning in the top left corner, based on the current margins, of course. But you can control that. You can maybe decide you would like it centered horizontally within those margins. And that's something that you control from right here in the print preview. The setting is normal margins. Or whatever margins you may have, that's where you're gonna go to access this. So I'll give that a click, and although you're probably used to maybe adjusting the different margin settings, what we wanna do is go into the custom margins option, just giving that a click. And within this dialog box, what we're able to do is we could manually adjust the margins, but really what we're in here to do is say, I want my spreadsheet to be centered horizontally. So rather than starting in the top left, it's going to position that centered between the margins that are currently set. So I'll give that a click to confirm that, and we can see that it is a little bit more centered within the current margins. Often enough, it's the content within the spreadsheet that may need to be adjusted in order for it to print properly. For example, here's a spreadsheet that we need to print. However, some of the information within the columns is being cut off. For example, I can't read first names, last names, divisions, departments, etc. And then in some cases, the columns are a little bit too wide. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at adjusting the column width, and we're going to look at wrapping the text to take better use of the space here. And quick enough way to fix this resizing column issue, I can select all of my columns, just clicking and dragging along the column letters at the top of the screen. And then coming between any two column letters, for example, I'm going to go between D and E, and just double click. This is the auto fit trick. We've looked at it in other videos, and what it does is it automatically resizes all of the columns that were currently selected. So now I can in fact read all of the names, divisions, departments, etc. It did not fix the issue where the columns are too wide for what's currently housed or contained within them. So to fix that, we're going to use a feature called wrap text. So let me go ahead and select some of these headings. just clicking and dragging to select them. And this is going to be on the home tab of the ribbon, and it's a setting called wrap text. Give it a click, and it doesn't look like it has accomplished much, but the wrapping is based on the width of the column and the height of the row. So for example, total hours. The heading itself is what's making that column so wide. The contents of it is quite narrow. I'm just scrolling down to show you, give you a better idea. What I want to do at this point is manually resize that total hour column, and I can do that by clicking and dragging the line, again, at the top of the spreadsheet, between the H button and the I button, just clicking and dragging to the left. And what that's going to do is maybe make that a little bit more narrow, right? Looks like I've lost my hours, so it looks like I've lost part of that title, that column header, but that isn't actually the fact. So what I'm going to do now is just make that row a little bit taller. So along the left side of the spreadsheet where the numbered row buttons appear, I want to bring my mouse pointer right between row 4 and row 5 and click and drag down, again manually. And what I can see now is that by changing the width or the height of that row, I'm now able to see the entire column header there. So you can certainly tweak it, and each column may need to be adjusted manually. I'm going to do the same thing now with overtime hours, just clicking and dragging to resize that column. And again, not something I can do universally like with the auto fit trick, but because each column is going to be a little bit different. But what I'm doing here is making better use of my space, right? The limited real estate that'll fit on a page. So again, you can go ahead and tweak that. And if you need to, you know, there are other alignment options. Don't forget, you can select your headings and do things like left align, centered, or right align, whatever it is that you think will look best at this point. Now let's take a look at scaling. Scaling will allow us to automatically shrink or enlarge the information on the printed page. The way that we work with scaling is through print preview. So I'm going to go ahead and go into file and print. If your spreadsheet is large, you may actually see a little print button here to reveal the preview instead of the preview itself. Just give it a click. With this spreadsheet, let's once again maybe change the orientation from portrait to landscape. And what's happening now is that not all of my columns are fitting on one page. I'm going to advance through the preview and give you a better look at this. So moving on along the bottom, using the next page to take a look there. And then what we have are two sort of stray columns out there on their own, disconnected from the other columns. So this can typically be corrected. If your spreadsheet is not too large, you can correct this through scaling. There are scaling options right here. So currently there is no scaling applied, but I'm going to give that a click. And using the sort of easy to select from choices, I'm going to say fit all my columns on one page. If you have a very large number of columns, this doesn't always help, and we'll look at an example of that a little bit later on in this video. But I give that a click, and it will be able to add all of those columns onto one page. So all the way across through gross pay. Now I'm down to 3 pages, and it's all fitting as we would expect. How does it accomplish that? What it does is, you know, just scale down the size of the information that is on there. It does it all automatically, so you don't have to waste your time doing it manually. There are a few other things that we want to explore while we're in here, so let's take a look. Page 1 looks really good. I have the title of my spreadsheet. I also have my column headers, but I lose that when I move on to the second page and the third page. Another thing that we may want to do is put in some page numbers. So if these pages do get out of order for whatever reason, we can get them back into order properly. So one of those things, the repeating headers, I cannot do here in print preview. So I'm going to use the back arrow. And what I want to do is I want to print these first 4 rows at the top of every page. That will include the title, the couple gap rows there, as well as the column headers themselves. So in order to accomplish that, I go over to page layouts, the tab of the ribbon. We looked at it earlier. This feature that we're looking for now is called print title. So I just give that a click. I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit and show you where we need to go in here, which is rows to repeat at top. I'm going to click in there and then just click to select the rows that I would like to repeat at the top of every page. It puts that range in, and I'm going to click on print preview. It's an option along the bottom so that I can jump in and make sure that that did in fact work. The first page isn't really the test. I'm going to move on to the second, and you can see that title and those column headers are there, and then will also be, of course, on the third page as well. Okay. In order to get the page information on here, I can do that through here if I happen to be in print preview. It's not one of the main buttons that I see in the print settings, but it's under page setup. So I'll give that a click. I can go into header footer. The header, of course, is information that will appear at the top of every page. Footer is at the bottom of every page. You can pick from one of the preset footers, for example, page 1 of however. Click on OK. And then each of my pages is now going to be marked. And that will lead to a much better printout. Let's return for a minute to the topic of scaling. So here I have a spreadsheet that is a little bit larger, meaning more columns than what we've seen in the past. And I'm going to go in and attempt to use scaling through File Print and switch that scaling to a setting we looked at earlier that solved our problem. It was fit all columns on one page. So choosing that option, what you want to understand is that sometimes it is just too small, and by doing this scaling, the information just becomes microscopic. So what we're going to do is look at solving this a little bit differently. So let me switch this scaling back to no scaling, because once again, at some point the scaling may reduce it to where the readability is just gone. So what we can do instead is maybe repeat some column information to tie back to the extra columns, or to the columns that print sort of far separated from where they belong. So this spreadsheet, 6 pages at this point. The first page is a group of employees and the first several columns up through supervisor. As I advance with the next page button along the bottom, I begin to see the information for the second group of employees and the third group, etc. And then once I get to page 4, what I'm seeing are the columns that tie back to the employees that are on the first page. So obviously I could try to scale, but like we saw earlier, it just reduces it to pass the readability. So another sort of solution would be to get some information from the the first few columns, so that I kind of understand who this information belongs to, because as it's sitting out here, it just doesn't really make any sense, and it's hard to really understand what's going on here and whose information this actually is. So we can look at a setting that we've actually explored already. I have to come out of print preview, where we can get one or more columns to repeat on the left side. So we did this earlier with the rows. We got the header rows to repeat. Well, you could do the same thing essentially with your columns. So we go over to the page layout tab. We click on print titles. And instead of rows to repeat at top, we're going to do columns to repeat at left. I'm clicking in there. I'm selecting the columns. I'm just going to do the first 2 columns here. Usually that's the sort of information that anchors the spreadsheet, and sort of, all the subsequent columns sort of tie back to that. Then I'm going to click on print preview. And the first 3 pages really are not going to be affected by this. But when I get to page 4, I can at least see whose information this is. Initially, it was just those last 5 columns or so, and I was sort of, just in the dark as to whose information that was. But by bringing those first 2 or 3, really it's up to you, columns back into the mix, I can at least make sense of this. Okay, now one more thing that we might want to consider if we are repeating columns is just the order that these columns and these rows are going to print in. So let's go to the first page for a minute and just take note. I have a group of employees. This is the first 20 or so rows. Then as I move on to page 2, it's the next 20 or so rows. And when I get to page 3, it's the last few rows, okay? So what Excel does is it prints rows down, and then as we get to the next page, it is now printing the subsequent columns. So that means across. So after it's printed all of the rows, it comes and prints the remaining columns. That format is down and then across, right? So what the end result is that this page, right, page 4 in the order of things, is actually the information that is covered back on the first page, right? So the first page, we have our first group of employees, and we don't see the last of them or the remaining information for that same group of employees till we get to page 4. If we want, we can bump that a little bit closer in a little bit of a hidden option. Let's go in and take a look. You get there through page setup. It's on the sheet tab, and it's right here. So down and then over is the default print order. But if I switch that to over then down, what happens, and I'll have to just move back to page 1 for a minute. I have my first group of employees and the first columns up and through whatever fits on that first page. And then when I go to page 2, it is the same group of employees and the remaining columns. So there's not that big of a gap. They are a little bit closer together, which of course helps with the readability of the printed spreadsheet. And that's all for today's session. See you again soon.